What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Baldur's Gate 3, some months after the game's official release, though I did do a launch review to kick things off. And in many ways, since then, Baldur's Gate 3 has proved to be a gigantic smash hit, one of the biggest releases of the year, that pushed the genre into mainstream attention, or at least this individual game, which is unusual as someone who covers that genre pretty intently, I would say. It's rare to see one do that well, let alone be a genuine contender for Game of the Year. And after playing the game for roughly 500 hours, across about 11 playthroughs, in an attempt to sort of soak up everything this game had on offer, I have a lot of thoughts in both directions. There are some places where I think this game stumbles, and some other places where I think it really pushes a lot of things forward. Now, before we dive into all that, however, I do review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform. My Steam profile is public and linked below if you want to check that out, and while achievements are included in that metric, they are far from being the only thing, and I think in that particular regard, Baldur's Gate 3 is a prime example of exactly that, as it only took about 3 playthroughs to grab the achievements, but I went on to play it for hundreds hours more. There are a couple other things I need to mention as well. I did, in between the initial launch of this game and this review, do a sponsored video for Larian Studios, in which they asked me to discuss Mind Flayer lore. You can still find that on the channel if you're interested. So it's important I disclose that to you, but this review is not sponsored, nor would any review I do ever be sponsored. And last but not least, before we start diving more fully into this video is going to be full of spoilers. The launch review I did is pretty spoiler-free. If that's what you're looking for, that video exists. But in this particular one, months after the game's release, there's a lot of things I want to talk about, and it's simply not possible to do so without spoiling a great deal of it. And with all of that said, let's start jumping into this thing and talking about it. Now, as I'm sure most everyone is aware, Baldur's Gate 3 is an isometric CRPG, though technically the word isometric now is not literal, as that refers to a very specific camera angle, but in many ways it is just used to mean top-down anymore. But in any event, this particular game puts us in the role of a custom or origin character, as the game calls them, as we navigate a Mind Flayer crisis involving being tadpoled by Mind Flayers, which is how they reproduce, which leads to us developing all sorts of illithid powers, or another word for Mind Flayers basically, which kicks off a series of events in and around, of course, Baldur's Gate. And we'll discuss the story more in just a moment. In a broader sense, what Baldur's Gate 3 was trying to do was, of course, live up to the very high legacy of the original 2 games, which are generally regarded as some of the best RPGs from that period and of all time, while at the same time pushing the genre forward. And remarkably, I think Larian Studios has mostly delivered on that, outside of a few stumbles here and there. Those stumbles being mostly centered around quality of life things that realistically even now could probably still be added later on, as Larian is known to support their games for quite some time. But at the same time, excluding even those things, because of Baldur's Gate 3's dependence on 5th edition D&D, which is the tabletop rule set this game utilizes, it's also not going to appeal to everyone just because of that. You see, in many ways, 5th edition D&D is a streamlined version of prior systems that were much more mechanically complex, which has resulted in, of course, the mainstream appeal of things like Dungeons & Dragons these days, with 5th edition D&D being the most popular tabletop game by a country mile. But there are people like myself who honestly prefer more complex systems like, say, Pathfinder 1e or even Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, which is also a far cry from the original systems the first 2 games were built off of, which was 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Which I tell you because frankly there's a lot of room for people not to enjoy everything about this game despite it being so universally enjoyed. And while I'm not going to focus on this a ton for the bulk of the video, I do want to put it up here at the beginning where I've seen a lot of conversation about how this game is going to push standards forward for RPGs and just sort of generally change the landscape. And I've certainly talked about some of those things myself previously, but as we get into this review, I think the main thing I would like to see Baldur's Gate 3 do and inspire from people personally is simply to push them to check out other games in this genre, because while Baldur's Gate 3 is unique and that's what gave it its appeal in the first place, it's a recent entry to a genre that is chock full of wonderfully told and executed RPGs that, while admittedly a bit more difficult to get into thanks to more complex rule sets and arcane methods of learning information, but if you liked Baldur's Gate 3, really it's just the tip of the iceberg for what the genre has to offer. So at the end of the day, when it comes to the legacy of this game, we'll kind of course, just have to wait and see how it pans out, what it inspires from other people. Though with all of that said, let's jump into this thing and talk about what has made people have those conversations to begin with. Kicking it off with the technical state of the game. Normally this is a bigger deal for games right as they release, as informing people of the launch state of a video game and how it's playing in terms of its performance is an important part of a review these days. I wanted to talk about the technical state in this review specifically to talk a little bit about how the game has changed and improved since I initially reviewed it on launch, and some problems it frankly still has. So in my initial review, most of what I had to say about performance was that when you got to the city, you would see a lot of FPS drops, alongside a variety of just minor bugs like missing dialogue options, text strings for book descriptions, that kind of stuff that won't really affect your game overall, but they are plentiful. Now, in the 4 major patches and many hotfixes since release, much of that has been addressed. Things have been balanced and adjusted. Some of the abilities I specifically mentioned in that initial review have been nerfed a little bit, as an example, alongside just general bug fixes. So, in many ways, the game has definitely improved, technically speaking. A lot of the little stuff has been ironed out, and up until patch 4, the game was running pretty flawlessly for me, even in the city proper. Though that said, I do have a very high-end PC for these things, so that was somewhat expected. But I do think it's worth mentioning that patch 4, which just released a few days ago from the time this video is launching, introduced some sort of new problem to the city where it's like your game is lagging when you're actually in town, and the game is suddenly really struggling to load basically anything, which makes it borderline unplayable for some people, myself included, obviously. But a quick look at the resource monitor on my computer tells me I'm not even using half of my available RAM when this is happening, so obviously it's some sort of problem introduced by this patch that with any luck will hopefully be ironed out quickly. But my point in telling you all that is simply that there are still a variety of issues, some major, some minor. I haven't really encountered anything too game breaking. Most of what I encountered was really minor stuff that only took seconds to work around, and that issue with patch 4 is probably the most significant issue I've had since beginning to play the game, period. And what's more, while since launch the game has released on PlayStation 5, it is eventually coming to Xbox. It was announced, though while that is slated for before the end of this year and they are working on it, we don't have an exact timeline for that yet. With that in mind, I hope it's before Christmas for everyone, but it's still very much so wait and see on that front. Now from there, I want to move on to the difficulty settings of the game. There are 3 in total, essentially easy, normal, or hard, but in my personal opinion, I think they could do with one more past the tactician difficulty, or hard mode, that increases the difficulty a little bit further, probably by reducing the drop rates of certain things like potions and scrolls. But to give you a basic rundown of easy, normal, and hard, it is important to first tell you that it's definitely required to know the system still. Even on easy, you can definitely still lose if you don't know what you're even attempting to do in terms of the dice rolls or how all of the modifiers are calculated. And while I've made plenty of videos on exactly that subject to help ease people into this game, which is kind of what I do for all CRPGs as I love the genre, and again, decoding them can be a bit arcane at times, without a basic understanding of what the system is and how it works, you might run into some issues. With that said, let's talk about how the game differs with each of these difficulties. On story mode, enemies have less health, your health is doubled, and enemies are easier to hit. And in some cases, I believe they even reduced enemy numbers a little bit. Normal is, of course, the developer intended experience. If you're looking to experience the game, really all you need to do is play this on normal. That's kind of what they had in mind, and thanks to a variety of things and how the game is balanced, which we'll talk more about in just a second, you can approach normal especially, and easy by default of course, in any manner in which you like, and you're definitely going to be able to find a way forward. And that's probably where this game is at its best, in that it just kind of hands you all these systems and lets you come up with the solution in a way that is almost reminiscent of immersive Sims. Then we have tactician difficulty. If you're unfamiliar with D&D or CRPGs at large, this might be difficult for you, and if that's the case, even story or normal might be hard for you, which is perfectly fine. Everybody's got to start somewhere. Tactician difficulty does make a few changes to the game beyond just combat in an attempt to make it more difficult. For starters, when you rest in the game, you would normally require supplies for this. and you would need 40 of said supply value to rest under normal circumstances, whereas Tactician doubles that number. It also increases enemy health by a certain amount. It also introduces new tactics, and the amount of enemies goes up in a few different cases. And what's more, in certain fights, it even adds extra modifiers outside of the difficulty alone, such as there being fights that you cannot guarantee that you get advantage, which is to say a better chance to hit, on your abilities in certain instances. And while Tactician will certainly prove a challenge if you're unfamiliar with these systems, the problem is, if you're familiar with these games and you play them all the time, Tactician is not a big challenge in any way. Which is why I said the game could frankly use another further difficulty that, in my opinion, could take a few different forms, but I think probably the most straightforward option would be to reduce the availability of a lot of scrolls and potions, or maybe increase their cost, to make resources in general a little less available. Because as it stands, while the game is very approachable and its focus honestly is on the story, if you are the type of persons who enjoys these games for the challenge of them, that's a place where Baldur's Gate 3 falls a bit flat. And some of that's by design. Again, the focus is on the story. But it would be nice if they added a further difficulty for people like myself who just really enjoy that tactical challenge on top of these things. Because as it stands, even on Tactician, you can pretty handily beat this game completely solo. And while the game isn't set up for it, nor does it really expect you to do that, it certainly is possible. And what I mean by that is that the game doesn't offer an achievement, there is no reason to approach the game solo other than you just want to. And this is made very apparent by a lot of the cinematics when you are playing the game solo. Often those conversations will still refer to you as a group, as if you had party members with you. The game will often still stop at certain points when you would normally have party members with you to try to give them a chance to say their lines, but they're not there, so it just sort of awkwardly cuts away. So that one method of increasing the difficulty for somebody like myself isn't even clearly fleshed out all the way. Which brings me, though, to the balancing aspect of the game, because if there's any part of Baldur's Gate 3 that impresses me more than anything else, it is how this game is balanced. As I somewhat mentioned during that section on difficulty there, you can approach this game in just about any manner you want. In fact, you can play through the game in solo Tactician mode in a variety of different ways and approaches that are all very viable. You can play through the game taking one level in every single class if you want, which makes a bit of a monstrosity of a build, which I've also done, and that is also an incredibly valid and viable way to play through the game. So having a game that is balanced in a way that accommodates ridiculous things like that to the opposite end of the spectrum, where you can play through solo on the hardest difficulty, while making sure the game offers something unique and at the same time is completable, is a genuinely remarkable feat. To my mind, hands down, the most impressive thing this game does is not its cinematics, it's not its story, it's not its characters, etc. It's how they set this up to make sure you could always get through it, provided, of course, you have the will to do so. Because a prominent feature in other entries in this genre is that, in many cases, on the highest difficulty, a lot of the approaches and options just simply aren't possible. You cannot do them because they will not work. So seeing a CRPG that manages to encompass so many different playstyles across all its difficulties is genuinely remarkable to me, which is why that aspect of the game outshines even the other already very impressive parts, like the production values, for instance. But you can't talk balancing without talking a little bit about the Karmic Dice feature, a somewhat controversial introduction to the game that many people talked about. As you'll see on screen when you're rolling for any basically ability check, in conversation, etc., but also in combat when it's done behind the scenes, dice are being rolled, and while this is obviously more of a computer program than literal dice, a feature that was introduced called Karmic Dice attempts to balance out the highs and lows of this process, because in the normal sort of gameplay loop of that, it would be possible to potentially roll like 10 nat 1s in a row, which is to say you failed something 10 times because the roll of the dice. That's just how it works. And while Karmic Dice will prevent that from happening, because basically if you have a streak of really good or really bad luck like that, the game will step in and sort of just alter it. But as I just mentioned, it doesn't do that just when you're doing really badly, it also does that when you're doing really, really well. So Karmic Dice's intention is to flatten out those sort of moments of extremes. And having played through the game, both with this feature on and off, I've got to tell you, I mostly only noticed when it was off. In fact, when it was on, from a gameplay perspective, outside of just knowing it was on, I couldn't really tell. And while I have seen many videos that have done like the number crunching and how it can even affect things like damage, etc., in my personal experience, the only really, I would say, noticeable thing that happened is when I had Karmic Dice off, there were multiple times that I would roll like 5 or 6 nat 1s just in a row, which is obviously extremely unlucky, and it wasn't happening when Karmic Dice was on because that's what it's designed to prevent. But at the same time, in telling you that, I also acknowledge that I, as a person, did not notice when the opposite was true, when I was just critting regularly. I was just like, oh, I'm just playing super well. And it occurred to me that that feature is likely designed to combat people's natural inclination towards just acknowledging only the negative, which I admittedly found myself guilty of. So while it's an interesting feature to include in a game like this, and I can think it can be preferable in many cases, at the end of the day, it's an option. If you don't want it messing with your dice rolls and you want it just completely to be the way the dice roll, then turn it off for yourself, though do know that it is on by default every time you start a playthrough. I think it's supposed to save it, but I always found myself having to turn it back on or off. Now from there, let's talk the story and my thoughts on it. Again, completely spoiling all of this. So in order to give you my full thoughts on the story, I do have to start a little bit previously with the original 2 games, because I have a few, I would say, major annoyances with the way Baldur's Gate 3's story is told, which admittedly only matter to me because I love these games, but honestly 99% of people don't care, and I think the approach they took probably makes for a better game, but this is a big, ridiculous, over-the-top review, so we're doing it anyway. Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 told the story of the Ballspawn, that is to say, the children of the God of Murder. The God of Murder got murdered, and in order to potentially facilitate his return, he had a bunch of kids who inherited his divine essence, but all, kind of by the exact nature of that divine essence, had an extreme urge to murder and maim people, which brought all sorts of chaos to the realm that resulted in a few literal wars, and how the events of all that played out is what Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 handles. We play Gorion's Ward, one of the Ballspawn, and while I won't regale you with a complete retelling of those games, because I have videos for that too, I will tell you how it ends. You see, Baldur's Gate 2, and its expansion more specifically, ended with all of the children of Bald besides you finally dying, or at least so you thought, and you could either ascend to godhood and become the new God of Murder and turn that into something more positive or just embrace the evil nature of it, or you could reject that power and continue to live as a mortal. That is the canonical ending. Canonically speaking, the protagonist of those 2 games was a man named Abdul Adrian, who then went on to, after this happened, become a Grand Duke of Baldur's Gate, where he helped guide the city's governance and everything up until 10 years before the beginning of Baldur's Gate 3, at which point the actual second to last Ballspawn showed up, got into a fight with Abdul, and they both died, which culminated in the resurrection of the God of Murder, Ball. And the reason I'm telling you all that is to explain here in just a moment that Baldur's Gate 3 for the most part respects what is considered canon from those previous games. However, where it feels appropriate, it fudges a lot of the numbers and the dates and attempts to explain some of it away. And again, I think that probably makes for a better story overall, admittedly, but it's also worth mentioning that a lot of that canon lore that I just mentioned, the canonical outcome of Baldur's Gate 2, was not exceedingly popular lore, which is why going into this game, I fully expected Larian to either outright ignore or mostly just make it so vague that it didn't matter, which is why I thought it was really interesting that while the vast majority of the game refuses to name Abdul as the previous game's antagonist, despite you meeting people who definitely would have known him like previous companions from the original game, there is actually one reference to this character by name called Abdul's Shield, which you can get from an NPC who wasn't in the previous games, thus confirming the stuff with Abdul, and theoretically, what happened 10 years before the start of this one, was accurate. Which brings us to some of the marketing or build up to Baldur's Gate 3, in which they had a sort of investigation thing by the community that discussed an event 15 years prior to the start of Baldur's Gate 3 with a serial killer in the city. This serial killer turns out to be one of the origin characters, the Dark Urge. The Dark Urge, a customizable origin character with a set backstory, ultimately turns out to be a true Ballspawn, which is probably, I would say, the biggest connection between this game and the previous ones. But if you've been paying attention to everything I've said up to this point, none of that makes any sense. In order for Ball to be resurrected, all of the Ballspawn had to die, but apparently this one was alive before the events that led to Ball's resurrection, But apparently, long before that, he managed to have another offspring that apparently wasn't required to die, so it all gets increasingly blurred. And the game does actually have a few, I would say, dialogue lines late in the game when you can meet the main antagonist of Baldur's Gate 1 and have a conversation with him as the Dark Urge that attempts to explain some of this away, but I don't even think that's done particularly well. So all of that just to tell you that as someone who's a big fan of the previous games, my biggest gripe in relation to is this game a worthy sequel to its predecessors is that they really messed up a lot of that lore for seemingly no reason. And while in some ways I do think it makes for a better story, it will annoy me to no end from now until forever. But let's talk about the rest of the story because it doesn't end there. There's a lot of things I like and a few that I don't. The game kicks off, of course, with us being infected by Mind Flayer tadpoles alongside many other people, which would normally lead us to turn into Mind Flayers ourselves, but it quickly becomes apparent that that is not happening, and these tadpoles are now giving us some sort of unusual psychic power and the ability to communicate with others. Telepathically, of course. And what starts as a journey to simply try to remove these tadpoles from our brains spins into a much larger narrative involving gods and attempts to take over the realms of Faerun and the Sword Coast. And while I won't regale you with every single detail of that journey, there's a few things I want to mention in each act. For starters, the first act of the game, which is naturally what most people are going to be most familiar with, is a conflict between druids of a druid circle and goblins who are there looking for a weapon. The weapon turns out to be the artifact that is preventing you from transforming into a Mind Flayer. So in both that way and in regards to looking for a cure, which leads you to a potential healer being trapped by the goblins, you get embroiled in that situation. And that, I would say, is where the game is at its best in terms of its choice and consequence. There's so many ways to resolve that situation, get everybody murdered, side with the druids, the grove, betray people. It's just a real playground of options. But that leads us into the much darker Act 2, where we enter the shadow-cursed lands, trying to find the source of the tadpoles known as the Absolute, which is the one granting all of these powers in some way, which has led to the cult of the Absolute, which is worshipping the thing as a god. And at the end of Act 2, you found out that this is actually an Elder Brain, the giant brain leaders of the Mind Flayers, but the Elder Brain itself is actually being dominated by a fantastical relic called the Crown of Karsus, which has way too much lore to explain in a video like this, but is being utilized by the Chosen, or the champions of the Dead Three, one of which is Baal, and his two other sort of companion gods, Merkel and Bane, who all ascended to godhood at the same time in a bizarre deal with a previous god known as Jurgle, and the champions of these gods are dominating the Elder Brain in an attempt to take over the world. Act 2 ends with us killing the champion of Merkel, and it quickly becomes apparent that the alliance between these three champions is falling apart very quickly, and the army they have gathered via this Elder Brain and the Absolute is going to march on Baldur's Gate proper, and we need to both stop it to save ourselves and potentially the city. It then becomes apparent there's a more evil option or so, especially when, on our way to Baldur's Gate, it turns out that the presence within the artifact or the weapon that has been keeping us safe from transforming into a Mind Flayer is none other than a Mind Flayer itself, so one who seems in charge of its own faculties as opposed to being enslaved to the Elder Brain, actually stole the power to protect you from a Githyanki, a race of people who hate Mind Flayers, Prince, who has the power to disrupt their telepathic communications, which is how he's been protecting you, and that spirals into tangents of its own, culminating in a supposed 17,000 endings, which I'm already here to tell you simply is not true. With all that out of the way, let's dig into some more specific details on the story here and what I liked and what I didn't. For starters, what I liked, the way this story begins both gets you off to a running start. You have this tadpole, you need it cured, you know what to do, and then Act 1 is so chock full of sort of interlacing options that it's really impressive, and you can tell it was in early access for almost 3 years. But Act 2, which in combination with Act 1, in my opinion, makes up the sort of first half of the game, already becomes, I would say, much more reined in terms of options and where you go from there. A lot of the consequences of your choices in Act 1 have a handful of possible outcomes that results in a relatively narrow Act 2, and you cannot move on from Act 2 until you run into the deal with the Elder Brain and the champions of the Dead Three. And I'm fine with that overall, as at some point they have to sort of tie the story together, and at some point they're going to have to kind of slowly hem you in to make sure that you see that so you can continue the narrative in a way that makes sense. And having played through the game so many times, while I can say I'm a little bit disappointed that there wasn't anything super unique about the way Act 2 ends, even though it kind of sets up the illusion of possible other outcomes, there kind of just aren't any, I accept why those limitations are there. What bothers me, however, is actually when you switch from Act 2 to Act 3. As I mentioned, this is where you find out that the person protecting you in all these dreams and everything actually turns out to be the Emperor, the Mind Flayer who's been protecting you. What I don't like about this moment of the story is that it needlessly railroads you into a very specific choice, because in the conversation where this is revealed, you can choose to either accept that that's what's happening and help the Emperor out as he's being attacked by Githyanki, who want to free Orpheus, the person he's trapped, to help you with. It also gives you the option to attack the Emperor here, and if you do that, it just game overs you, meaning that you have to help the Emperor because you literally won't beat the game otherwise. But what bothers me is that they made this a forced decision when it realistically could have gone one of two ways. You see, just a little bit later in Act 3, Orpheus, it turns out, can be freed by an Orphic hammer, which is where Raphael, the Cambion, comes in, who's trying to make a deal with you, which I'm sure people have seen in promo trailers and the like, and he has the Orphic hammer, and you can deal with him to try to get it to free Orpheus. The thing is, it seems to be implied that the Emperor is the only thing keeping Orpheus chained up, which is why he was about to break free when Act 2 starts. And in Act 3, right before the end of the game, you can free Orpheus, have him protect you while you finish the last bits of the game up. And I guess for me, I just don't understand why they didn't move that moment to Act 2 and give you the choice between siding with the Mind Flayer, the Emperor, or Orpheus right then and there, because they force you to side with the Emperor here, only to then turn around and let you side with Orpheus again later anyway. And in a game that is full of choice and consequence, for that one random moment to be so forced on you, when they literally wrote a different route to it that they then give you like not even a few hours later, is truly bizarre to me. Just a very odd decision. And for me, it's definitely the lowest point of the story. It just doesn't make any sense. And while I can forgive the sort of fudged up lore from the previous two games that are over 20 years old, because admittedly, it bothers me, but it's whatever in the grand scheme of things, this is just kind of a blatant plot hole in the middle of this game for some reason. And it doesn't feel like it would have required much to just give you the same option a little bit earlier. So whereas up to this moment, where you certainly have times you're kind of forced into something, for instance, the boss of Act 2, the final guy you have to fight right before you enter Act 3, the champion of Merkel, is invulnerable before you go do some quests, and they'll let you attack him, but he's invulnerable. You're going to lose or you're going to have to run away one. And while that's technically a forced decision, you have the option to fight that guy and fail, run away, and then kind of go do the thing you have to go do. And I'm fine with stuff like that because at some point you have to tell the narrative, right? But the fact that they managed to handle that in a way that makes sense, but then messed this up like right after, just feels super odd to me. And then it doesn't help that, and honestly I assume potentially why they did this, is because of who the Emperor was. In Act 3, if you do a particular side quest, mostly Will's origin story specifically, you can learn that the Emperor is none other than Baldurin, the person who founded Baldur's Gate, who then became enslaved to the Elder Brain before breaking free of its control, which sort of led to this game, which is a great little plot twist and everything, but it all just feels very forced towards the end there. And then that finally culminates in the endings and the epilogue, or I would say kind of lack thereof in many cases. So a lot of people, especially right before release, hyped up this news thing about how there was 17,000 endings, and that is just simply not true. There are not 17,000 endings to this game. And while I would argue that there's a handful, I would say, that could be considered genuinely unique endings, if you want to get really specific, you could boil it down to basically good or bad if you wanted to, where you either save the city or you don't, and use the Crown of Karsus to become the bad guy. And there's a variation of that if you're playing the Dark Urge, where you do it for Baal and the whole world gets destroyed, but it's just the bad ending basically. And while there's a couple, I would say, valid endings previously to the actual main ending, for instance, if you have Gale in your party at the end of Act 2, you can actually have him detonate his orb and kill the Elder Brain early, which is not an ideal outcome, but does technically solve the problem. So there's things like that that you could consider extra endings. Personally for me, I would say there's about half a dozen that are unique enough to be considered unique endings. Now, the reason people say there's 17,000 and you see that repeated still is because because there are a ton of variations to the final cutscene. But this is stuff like how each origin character's story resolved. For instance, Astarion can either ascend to become a vampire lord or be stuck as a vampire spawn. And depending on your choice there, in the ending cutscene, you'll see what happens to Astarion. If he's a spawn, he starts burning up and runs off, for instance, but if he ascended, it's slightly different, and this goes for every single companion. And there's a ton of different combinations of what happened to those companions in combination to the main thing that either happened. You either saved the city or took over control of the Elder Brain and became a tyrant. And because of that, thanks to save scumming and things, you really only need to play through the game a handful of times, do a bit of save scumming, and you can see the bulk of the options available to you, like probably 95% of them. Though I will say the most impactful difference to the ending, for me, actually wound up being the romance scene for whoever you had romance throughout that particular playthrough. Based on who you romanced and what choices you made that then affect the outcome of that romance. For instance, if you have Lae'zel and you saved Orpheus, she's going to go off to liberate her people with Orpheus, who is technically the rightful ruler of the Githyanki. So if you romanced her, it's kind of like, sorry, but this is more important, bye. So there's an example of a variation to the outcome for your character there. And that happens across pretty much all the romances. There's various things about them. Now, a problem you might have heard about, however, comes with whether or not you didn't romance them or the specific decisions you made, because while I had played through the game a couple times in a way that gave me a satisfying end to the game, that is to say the cutscene represented the characters I cared about and what happened to them, a lot of times it fails to do so. And while Larian's been addressing that after the fact, especially in terms of Karlach, who had a pretty sad ending previously, but even now is still kind of a bummer, but in a lot of cases, really all you get for the wrap up for each individual character or the people you've met along the way is just a couple of lines of dialogue in the ending scene. You don't know what they went on to do, you don't know what happened to them after the fact, and in that way, the epilogue of this game still offers very little in the way of closure to a lot of these stories. In fact, it doesn't even go so far as to tell you what happened to the previous areas you had been to. And while you can lift the Shadow Curse from the Shadow Cursed lands and see that as you leave, you don't, as an example though, get any sort of breakdown for what happened to the Druid's Grove after the fact, what happened to that area, what happened to the city. And as a result of that, while sometimes you can play through the game and have, I would say, a pretty satisfying end to the game, there are a lot of other times where you play through it and the epilogues and everything are really underwhelming. So to summarize, the game really doesn't have that many endings, and depending on the choices you made throughout, the culmination of all those origin character stories can be really hit or miss as to whether or not you even get to find out what happened to them, in any meaningful way at least, which can put a bit of a bad taste in your mouth after all the time you almost certainly spent playing this game. Which finally brings us to the end of this section, and we can now finally move on. Let's talk about character creation a little bit. Character creation, of course, sees you defining what kind of character you want to make. Based on 5th edition D&D, of course, a lot of the rules from the player's handbook specifically are here with a few branching options into other places, but most of this is just player's handbook stuff. So you either decide whether you want to play a custom character, or TAV as they are known, or one of the 7 different origin characters who would normally make up your companions outside of the Dark Urge, who is only available as an avatar character. You then go on to pick your race, any applicable sub-race, your starting class, any options relevant to that class, before changing your ability scores and being on your way. I've explained a lot of this stuff in other videos that have much more time to go much more in depth, so if you're curious about how any of this stuff works more specifically, all of that is there for you. But for this video, a few important things to mention. This is mostly just your starting point. You can respec later pretty freely. You're going to meet a character named Withers, either early on into the game when you find him, or if you take too long, he'll just show up at your camp. And that NPC, who's related to the story and is probably Jurgle, the god who gave the Dead 3 their power, he's going to be able to just let you respec your character for like 100 gold, which is super cheap. So that, in combination with the magic mirror, which will let you customize the look of your origin characters or your hirelings, means that a lot of these decisions aren't final and you have options to work around them and change your strategy a little bit, which is going to prevent you from being stuck. And I say that basically to tell you, don't be too intimidated if you don't know what's going on here system-wise. Now, cosmetically speaking, they gave us all sorts of options to customize our character along with their race, and while it's not as free-form as like letting you sculpt your face like you see in something like Fallout 4, all of the various preset options and how they can combine to make a character will almost certainly give you a lot to play around with. And while I don't want to get too into the weeds of these things, because as I mentioned, I have videos that do that already if you're interested, what I do want to talk about is that character creation is where, if you're familiar with 5th edition D&D, you're likely going to notice that Larian made a lot of small subtle changes to the system to make it both translate to a video game better, but also to just feel better at the same time. They changed a lot of stuff in terms of how 5th edition D&D works to just frankly make them more fun in a way that wasn't necessary to make them work for a video game, but do make for better, I would say, implementations of those things. And while that does cut a little bit both ways, for instance, a lot of the more socially oriented things from the tabletop version don't always translate super well, they also made a ton of smart changes. Now, while that is good for the most part, and it makes a class like the Monk, who was normally very weak in the tabletop, at least comparatively to what other classes could be, have the ability to be a powerhouse in this game. And in fact, in terms of just like single target DPS, it's one of your best options if you go the open hand route. The problem with that is, or at least the problem I have with it, is that there is nowhere here in the character creation screen to click a button and pull up the progression and abilities that your race and class are going to get down the line, which is important because Larian has probably altered them in some way in many cases, which means even if you're familiar with 5th edition D&D, you're likely going to encounter a curveball playing this for the first time where they change things you may or may not be aware of. And not having the ability to look forward when they've already changed the source material is, I think, a real missed point when you've seen other games in this genre do that previously via Pillars of Eternity 2 or Wrath of the Righteous, for instance. And that's one of many ways I would say Baldur's Gate 3 sort of drops the ball when it comes to the quality of life situation that hopefully they'll add in the future, because I think it would just add a lot to the game for people who want all that information and don't want to have to go search it up in a wiki, as an example. Because while I'm happy to make money off making videos about these changes, which I did quite a bit of, it really shouldn't be necessary. Next up, though, I want to talk about the origin characters, all 7 of them, alongside the companions, but less so there. Now, I do want to start this section off by mentioning that while I do think a lot of these characters are really well written, have interesting narratives, especially when you're playing as them, and how you unravel those characters, whether or not you're romancing them or simply learning about them, adds quite a bit to the game. But as a personal note, I don't really care about romances in video games. I don't have anything against them, but they're not really what I play games for either. And given the fact that I would say much of the conversation around this game has been centered around those exact things, I don't really feel it's necessary to comment on them. But what I do want to do is talk a little bit about each character's individual story, how it relates to the main story, my thoughts on it, and what playing through the game as that character sort of adds to it, as I played through the game as an avatar of every single one of these. So let's kick things off with Astarion, our elven vampire spawn companion, who thanks to his tadpole is able to walk in the sun while finally being free of his master Cazador back in Baldur's Gate after suffering some pretty messed up torment at that person's hands. Astarion is loved by a lot of people. Personally, I found his default attitude when you're talking to him and you're not playing as him to be kind of annoying. He's not the kind of person I would ever get along with, but a lot of that from a narrative standpoint is of course used to mask a lot of the torment and deceit he's been living with, trying to just get by and survive as a vampire spawn to a cruel lord that definitely sees him more as a thing than a person. So I admit, while I don't like this character, there is a lot there to unravel and enjoy if you do. His main story, as you might imagine, revolves around dealing with Cazador now that you can kind of act freely on your own. And Cazador, it turns out, is using both Astarion and many other vampire spawn in a profane ritual to ascend to an ascendant vampire, which would let him walk in the sun and have all sorts of stronger vampire powers. Astarion can stop this and kill Cazador one way or the other, but then has to decide whether to ascend and take Cazador's place in that ritual or stay a vampire spawn forever. The ritual, though, requires the deaths of thousands of people, and Astarion is forced to decide between his own selfish gains, which he's been prone to, or acknowledging the fact that he would be essentially becoming the person he hates the most by doing that and sacrificing all those people, which makes for some interesting moments. Now, when it comes to actually playing as Astarion, there's a few unique moments, but two in particular really keep my memory, and that is early on in the game, Astarion, if he's just in your party, will attempt to bite you in your sleep, and this is how you find out he's a vampire for sure. If you're playing as Astarion, this scene plays out a little differently, where you have to choose who you want to bite, and then whether or not they notice you, though this is where it gets honestly a little funny. You see, if Astarion's just in your party and you decide to just let him bite you, he can actually kill you, but you can then be resurrected by someone in your party and the game continues on. There's even some funny dialogue about it. However, in reverse, if you kill someone while biting them while playing as him, that character is just dead permanently, which I was not expecting. I kind of just expected funny dialogue in reverse. And that really made that scene feel unique and have more weight to me. Now, another scene I really remember from Astarion's playthrough is towards the end of it when you're deciding whether or not to ascend. Because while my playthroughs up to that point had largely been indifferent to him as a character, I would say that moment is what really got me to understand the story they were trying to tell with Astarion, because you have to decide in that moment to either become what Cazador is and represents to you, or let go of all that power and your long-term ability to walk in the sun even, in exchange for doing the right thing. And I think it's such a wonderful moment to play through as the character that I just really didn't feel much for when I was just looking at it from that third-party view. It added a lot to the experience, though. Next up, we have Lae'zel, a Githyanki woman from Kresh Kalir, which is to say the place she grew up, more or less, but the Githyanki hate mind flayers. They used to be enslaved by them. I cover this more in that lore video I mentioned. But it's essentially Githyanki's sworn duty to hunt down and kill mind flayers at any cost in retribution for the slavery they underwent. They hate them. Somewhat ironically, they've essentially turned into what the Mind Flayers were, enslaving people, being this brutal race that looks down on others, which is why the Githyanki are only one half of the Gith race, the other being the Gith Zerai, who also hate Mind Flayers, but are a little more, I would say, concerned with not becoming essentially them. So Lae'zel's position as the Gith in a story that centers around Mind Flayers is already pretty interesting. And given what I told you earlier in the story section about how this culminates in finding out that their queen, Vlaakith, has actually been lying to them, and that the rightful heir to the Gith crown is Orpheus, the son of the woman named Gith who led the Githyanki to freedom, is a very big moment for her. It's world-shattering in many cases. And while Lae'zel has a very tough exterior, if you get to know her, her romance is actually pretty well fleshed out as well, and it becomes more clear that she's been lied to her whole life, and she has a lot to get to grips with, and she probably shows the most character development, in my opinion, of all of these characters, which makes it a real shame that playing through the game as her was not particularly interesting. It didn't really come with any scenes that really stuck with me. It was basically everything I already knew, and it was definitely one of the origins where you kind of saw everything by just having her in the party, and there really wasn't much to add from being her, which was a bit of a shame because outside of the Dark Urge, her story is probably my favorite. That brings us to Gale, though, the Wizard of Waterdeep, the fallen Archmage. Gale used to be an incredibly powerful wizard before his ambition got the better of him, as it often does with wizards who hunger for power of some form, because despite being with Mystra, both intimately and more theoretically, Mystra being the goddess of magic, by the way, Gale decided that in order to impress her further, he needed to seek out the remnants of Karsus, which led him to the Netherese orb, which then attached itself to him and started eating away at his magic abilities. Basically, Gale needs to eat magic now, or he will blow up and take out a 2-mile wide radius around him. It doesn't help that after this happened, Mystra basically disowned the guy, and he's been struggling to both stave off this explosion and work through his wounded pride at the failing of his relationship with Mystra at the same time. So there's a lot going on here, especially when you find out that the Netherese orb was actually part of the Karsite weave, and it is just eating magic completely, and the reason Mystra was so angry with him was because the Karsite weave represented a danger to magic everywhere, which involves more lore than I have time to explain. And a lot of Gale's story revolves around either making that ultimate sacrifice and setting off the explosion to deal with the Elder Brain, which results in you not even having trying to fight the thing, or giving in to his ambition for power and trying to get the crown of Karsus off of its head so he can attempt to become a god just like Karsus, the person the crown is named after, who it used to belong to, also tried to do, which is sort of the ultimate ambition for a wizard, as it turns out. And that temptation by power largely colors most of Gale's journey. He can either be pretty mild-mannered, overly polite, trying to do the right thing, an otherwise morally good person in a lot of morally gray situations, or he can definitely give in to that temptation of power, sort of blame everyone around him for everything that's happened to him, and it can go one of a few different ways, which makes for a pretty interesting story, but I'm so on Gale, it didn't really speak to me personally. A lot of it's pretty standard wizard stuff, but when you're playing through the game as Gale, you actually do get a few unique scenes with him, both at the beginning and then a little later towards the end. You also have to make the decision to detonate the bomb to take out the Elder Brain in Act 2 if he's with you, but you could have done that anyway if Gale was with you, so that wasn't really special. Now, at the beginning of the game, where you normally talk with Gale and try to give him magic items if he's in your party, when you are Gale, a lot of that is explained through the arrival of Terra. The flying cat, or Tressum, that Gale is associated with, comes to track Gale down, see how he's doing, and gives you a unique magical item to help with this particular problem. And this is here to replace that. Again, normally Gale would be talking to you about these things, but they kind of need someone to bounce that conversation off with, so they use Terra because all the other companions might get killed. And it was a nice little scene that gave you something unique while playing as Gale. And then the last unique thing, I would say, comes towards the end, after you beat the game, actually. You get an epilogue of sorts where you can either choose to embrace power or repent yourself to Mystra, which then kind of gives you a better understanding of what happens to Gale specifically if you're playing as him, though you don't see this scene if you're not playing as him. If you are just using Gale in your party, you simply get a scene where he kind of tells you whether or not he's going to go after the crown or not. And depending on your choices with him up to that point, it can be more difficult or easy to do so. So playing as him did give a few unique things, but his story felt a little flat for me in general, so there wasn't too much there. Next up, though, we have Shadowheart. Shadowheart is a cleric of Shar, the goddess of darkness, making Shadowheart, of course, the resident goth girlfriend. Now, the thing is, if you know about D&D, you know that Shar is the sort of opposite of Selûne, which is the goddess of the moon, and they are in a rivalry with each other. Because of that, it probably wouldn't be much of a surprise to you that Shadowheart, who tries to help people here and there in your party in general, even if she is very secretive, has to decide whether to stay loyal to Shar or convert to being a worshipper of Selûne once she finds out that her parents were actually abducted by other worshippers of Shar, and then she was raised as a cleric of Shar to further the unending war between Shar and Selûne. I actually like this story, but it is very on the nose. It's pretty much exactly what you'd expect once you find out she worships Shar, and while I don't have anything against it, it is, again, well done. It's just something I saw coming from a mile away, though Shadowheart does have a very important moment in the story where she gets an option no one else does. At the end of Act 2, you have the option to either release or capture, potentially, the Night Song, which is the source of the invulnerability for Ketheric Thorm in Act 2. Most characters can either set the Night Song free, or Dame Aylin as she's actually known, or if they side with the bad guys, Balthazar in particular, they can capture her instead. Shadowheart is actually empowered by Shar to kill Dame Aylin, who is otherwise immortal and only able to be killed if another god wills it. But in order to get that option, you need Shadowheart in your party, and in fact, if you don't bring her along for this mission, she will outright leave. And whether or not she chooses to kill the Night Song or spare the Night Song is the biggest determining factor in whether or not she worships Shar or Selûne, though there is more stuff to this a little later when you get to Act 3, when you find out that her parents are still alive. So all of that to tell you that Shadowheart is pretty connected to the main story. She's got a big moment that is unmissable. It's tied to the main story. There's a lot of involvement there. But playing as her does, again, kind of not really give you anything unique in terms of her story. It plays out pretty much the same way regardless. If you have a good relationship with her, you can push her towards one or the other and decide what she wants to do. And you're not really missing much by not playing as her. Really, the only unique scene she gets, I would say, is that in moments where she is talking to Shar in your party, you actually get to hear Shar's voice acting, which was certainly a nice touch, but not really enough to win me over. Then we have Will. Will is a warlock and servant to a fiend known as Mizora. Will entered into a pact with Mizora to save the city of Baldur's Gate from dragon cultists, and has since made a name for himself as the Blade of the Frontiers, who tracks down evildoers the coast over, and while people think he's a hero, he is actually in service to a devil. And initially, this puts him into direct conflict with Karlach, another origin character, as he wants to kill her per Mizora, which you can choose to do if you don't want Karlach on your team. Will actually got some rewrites from his early access version. They altered his story a little bit, but in any event, Will is the son of one of the Grand Dukes of Baldur's Gate, Uldur Ravengard, another character who personally knew Abdel Adrian from the previous games, or the canonical character from the previous games. Will, being a folk hero of sorts, or at least attempting to save the world, naturally kind of just involves himself in the plot here and wants to save the city of Baldur's Gate. He later finds out his father's been abducted by this cult and wants to save his father as well, and he has a lot of inner turmoil about accepting this deal and sacrificing his soul essentially for the sake of preserving the things he cares about in this world, which gets a little further complicated later when Mizora ties freedom from his pact to the life of his father. You have to either choose to save his father or let him die. Then Will can either become the Blade of Avernus, as he calls it, who hunts down evildoers everywhere, or he can ascend to the throne of a Grand Duke in Baldur's Gate, which you can help with. Another interesting thing about Will's story, though, is that it puts you in connection with the plot thread that leads to the reveal that the Emperor, the Mind Flayer, is actually Baldurin. So Will's story has a lot going on, but it admittedly feels a little disconnected from the main story in comparison to a lot of the others. And when it comes to playing as Will, you do get a few interesting interactions with your patron, Mizora, especially as the few options where you defy or embrace what Mizora asks you to do per your pact will have more interesting effects. For instance, in Act 2, it's possible to kill Mizora, but doing this kills Will, and if you're playing as Will, that's obviously a game over. So little things like that. And then it's hard to talk about Will without also talking about Karlach, as they are tied a bit together. Karlach is our final companion origin character, who is the Fury of Avernus, a prior bodyguard to Lord Gortash, one of the champions of the Dead 3 we talked about, before he sold her essentially into slavery in the first layer of Hell, Avernus, where the archdevil there, Zariel, implanted in her a demonic engine that fuels her fury, which is why she is such an effective barbarian. At the beginning of the game, thanks to the Nautiloid you're on briefly traveling through the plains of Hell, Avernus specifically, Karlach manages to escape Avernus, but she got tadpoled at the same time, meaning that in addition to this engine that's going to kill her, now she's got this tadpole in her head. Will also wants her dead because Mizora is actually a servant of Archdevil Zariel. By the way, Zariel's a super cool character, and while she doesn't feature in this game, easily one of my favorite D&D characters, period. Now, Karlach, over the course of her story, finds out that being outside of Avernus, her engine is killing her. It's going to destroy her if she doesn't return to Avernus. And while she's able to make some adjustments to make it last longer, her choice ultimately winds up in either returning to Avernus to not die, but, being hunted for the rest of her life, or accepting her death with some grace. It's also technically possible for her to turn into a Mind Flayer, which fixes it, which personally I found to bizarrely be the best ending for her, but otherwise her story's a little bleak. She was added pretty late into the development from what I understand, so outside of being a bodyguard to Lord Gortash, and of course just having the tadpole, she isn't super tied to the main story like the rest of them, with most of her quest-specific stuff being around just trying to solve the problem of the engine, which there isn't really anything they can do about, and she either dies at the end of the game, returns to Avernus, or lives the rest of her life as a Mind Flayer, which all aren't exactly ideal situations, let's say. And because of that, I didn't find playing through the game as Karlach particularly satisfying. A lot of the scenes are the same. Some of the stuff she talks to your main character about is instead presented as conversations when you're sleeping in camp, but that's about as crazy as it gets, so it wasn't really for me, all in all. That brings us to our final origin character, though, and this is the Dark Urge. As I already talked about pretty thoroughly in the story section, the Dark Urge is actually a Ballspawn, a child of the god of murder, which means they are linked to a burning desire to murder and maim people. However, when you start the game as the Dark Urge, you are an amnesiac. You don't remember anything, so you don't even know what I just told you. You just know that you have this urge to kill. Though realistically, if you played the first games who described Ballspawn as exactly that, it was immediately obvious what this was, so not a huge surprise. But over the course of the game, a butler appears, which again was from the previous games as well, not this one specifically, but the concept, and this butler pushes you to do all sorts of terrible things. And if you do them, you'll earn rewards, such such as an incredible cloak that makes you invisible after killing something, and then in Act 2, you're granted the ability to turn into the Slayer, another thing from the previous games indicative of particularly spiteful Baal spawn, in which they could take on one of the forms of the god of murder Baal, the Slayer, and use it to their own ends. Towards the end of Act 2 and the start of Act 3, you find out, of course, that your character was in fact robbed of their position in the Temple of Baal by Orin the Red, the granddaughter of Saravok Anchev, the antagonist from the main game. Now this is interesting because Orin sort of used your complacency to usurp you. She essentially ambushed you, had you tadpoled and thrown out. If you are not playing as the Dark Urge, then that character died, but if you are the Dark Urge, then you lived. The Dark Urge, prior to the start of the game, previously was in on the plot with the Elder Brain and the Mind Flayers. They wanted to plunge the world into death and chaos for the sake of the god of murder, Baal. Orin, however, thought she would be better suited to do this, as she brought more artistry to the idea of murder, according to her, and attacked you for it. And while Orin, and honestly you in this case, were definitely both psychopaths, Orin isn't a true Baal spawn, which is something I haven't mentioned up to this point, but children of Baal spawn aren't a new thing. There's actually one or two of them in the original games as well. But those grandchildren do not inherit the divine essence that effectively makes them a demigod, so to speak, like their parents did. They don't inherit any of that. So a grandchild of Baal in this case is just a normal person outside of, being a psychopath in Orin's case. And because of all that, Orin is Baal's sort of second favorite, so to speak. And you can, in the Dark Urge story, take back the Temple of Baal from her in a fight to death in front of the eyes of your father, the god of murder. And this leads to a unique ending for the Baal spawn, where you can either free the city like normal and save it, or you can dominate the Elder Brain and literally destroy the entire world by murdering everyone, which is a little over the top, but hey, technically a unique ending. Now, main story-wise, in my opinion, the Dark Urge is clearly the main character. It directly connects to the previous games the most, and outside of the obfuscated lore that they kind of bended and molded to make this story possible, I enjoyed it a great deal. You can either resist this urge and be the good guy successfully, just like Abdul Adrian did before you, or you can embrace it fully, which is a great deal of what the original games were all about anyway. And because of that, to me, the Dark Urge is the main character, and seeing as you can only play the game as them, that's pretty much the experience. That said, we're not quite done yet because there are 4 more companions to talk about. These are just companions. You can bring them along if you make certain decisions, but they are not origin characters. You cannot play as them, but they can be in your party. These are Halsin, Jaheira, Minthara, and Minsk. Halsin and Minthara you're going to meet pretty early on, but you cannot recruit them until Act 2. Halsin is the Archdruid of the Druid's Grove, and Minthara is leading the Absolute Forces in Act 1, trying to find the Githyanki relic. Halsin, I would say, is the default option. If you do the traditionally good path, you're going to find and rescue Halsin. He joins you in Act 2. He's a druid, big burly guy, has a unique connection with nature, and I'm sure everyone saw the promo material with the bear stuff that I don't really want to get into. Honestly, I thought he was super dull personally, but then we have Minthara. Of all the non-origin companion characters, Minthara is my favorite. But in order to get her, you have to do some pretty messed up stuff in Act 1. And then after this, you can find out that Minthara wasn't even doing this of her own volition. She was sort of dominated by the Elder Brain, so to speak, and forced to do it. And she wasn't really herself. And you can save her from a death sentence, kind of literally, in Act 2, where she can then join your party. Minthara, being a drow, has led a pretty messed up life up to this point that ultimately led her into contact with the Elder Brain, which is how everything kicked off. She was a paladin of Lolth initially, though she swore an oath of vengeance. That oath sustained her after everything that happened to her, and now she's kind of declaring vengeance on the people that did that to her, and she has a remarkably in-depth story despite what you have to do to recruit her. Now, the downside to Minthara is, as interesting as she is, and she is a romanceable character, of course, her story's not exactly finished. It's kind of bugged out towards the end, which can leave her feeling a little bland. But then we have Jaheira and Minsk, previous companions from the older games. Jaheira is a very important character from the first 2 games. She's a druid and a harper. Her husband was killed at the hands of the antagonist from the second game. She was a romanceable character in that game as well, once she kind of healed from her trauma even. So needless to say, she was very integral to the series up to this point, and her being back is of no surprise to me personally, but she's gotten quite old. She is a half-elf, which is how she's survived this entire time, as she is well over 100 in this game, and she is admittedly pretty fan-servicey. You can find her house in Baldur's Gate 3, you can talk to a bunch of the kids she's taken in off the streets, you can find her secret refuge where she still has some mementos of her previous husband who died in the last game, and there's a lot going on there. Jaheira, however, has a set of story quests that will lead you to Minsk. Minsk is the last companion, and he's really hard to recruit. Painfully so, actually. You have to do a bunch of quests to find out where he is, what he's been up to, and then when you fight him, you have to make sure you don't accidentally kill him, so you have to turn non-lethal attacks on, and Jaheira has to be in your party, and if you mess up any of those steps, Jaheira will leave and Minsk won't be recruitable. But Minsk is incredibly late in the game. By the time you recruit him, the game is just about over. So he doesn't have a lot of characterization, which is probably for the best because if you know anything about Minsk, he's not, let's say, the most stable person, but he does have a pet hamster that is also part of his character. And if I'm being honest, even as somebody who loves the previous games, I find Minsk incredibly annoying. He feels like a tacked-on addition that really didn't need to be here, honestly, as he adds very little to the title. He's essentially comedy relief as a character, and I just don't care for it, if I'm being honest. You could cut him out of this game and it wouldn't make a difference at all. Now that we have all of that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about some, I would say, broader thoughts about the companions in general. So for me, an interesting thing about all these characters is that all of them are united by the thread of being used and potentially betrayed by all of the other characters involved in their story. Gale is being used and betrayed in many ways by Mystra. Karlach was used and betrayed by Lord Gortash. The Dark Urge was used and betrayed by Orin. And the list goes on. And that kind of brings together a lot of the core themes of the story, with these companions being about trust and betrayal, deciding who you can trust, what the stakes are, and how that relates to both them as an individual and the story at large. And in that regard, I think all these companions are really, really well written. Now, coincidentally, that brings us to the camp system, where all of these characters you have recruited will be gathering, and you yourself will be finding rest at throughout the game. Basically, anytime in-game, you can click a button, hit go to camp, and this takes you to a separate area where you can talk to your companions, sort your inventory, handle things like that, set up who's in your party, etc. This is also where you will long rest for the day, as you have to rest to do things like restore your spell slots and abilities that return on either short or long rest, etc. In between long rests at camp, you have a couple of short rests, which are instantaneous little healing buffs outside of combat that will restore the appropriate resources as well. And your camp is an interesting thing because, for instance, if you are playing solo, it will be pretty much devoid of life, there's nobody there. But if you are actively recruiting characters and even NPCs who might join you temporarily, your camp can be all full of life, changing dynamically, which brings little different events like bringing Scratch along, being able to play fetch with him, just to name a few. So the camp and your ability to long rest there, which triggers a lot of the cutscenes between the party members, is really where you're going to feel a lot of the inter-party dynamics of all these people come together, which can result in fights between Lae'zel and Shadowheart, for instance, alongside your party members being witness to important story events otherwise, such as Vlaakith confronting Lae'zel, or Will and Karlach confronting each other. And that sort of camp system and the party dynamics that play out there felt very, I would say, Dungeons and Dragons to me. It was when I was feeling the most like I was playing this party-based RPG, and I think they handled that really well. But all of that brings us to the progression systems of this game. There's a handful of things I want to talk about here. Now, I did already talk about, I would say, the most important element, and that is that they made small adjustments to the system as a whole, that is 5th edition D&D, to make things feel a little bit better. And this is really important when you're leveling characters up in particular, because stuff that probably wouldn't see a lot of use in the tabletop is now more viable, and vice versa. Things that are very useful in the tabletop due to this being a video game might not be quite as useful, such as a lot of the illusion wizard type stuff I found didn't translate quite as well. Not to say that you couldn't, because the game is balanced in such a way that you can play them even on normal and it's not a big deal in any way, just something of note. Now, your primary form of progression is leveling up. We have a level cap of 12 compared to the normal level cap of D&D, which is 20, but once you get above 12 and start hitting those higher level spells, which can do all sorts of crazy stuff, they have that much more trouble implementing them into a video game, and while some games have tried this, it usually results in them having to cut a lot of the reasons you would want to go to those higher levels anyway, which wouldn't exactly feel satisfying in a game like BG3. But however you feel about that particular issue, When leveling up, you'll be brought to a character screen, and you can also multi-class, that is to say, combine various classes together. And while this normally has stricter requirements outside of BG3 here, Baldur's Gate 3 has largely removed a lot of those restrictions, such as minimum certain stats and ability scores required to do so. Here it's pretty freeform, which can allow you to do things that you wouldn't be able to do in the tabletop. They're also just a ton of fun at the same time, and that is a change I very much so enjoyed. As you can tell, they definitely tried to reduce the friction between you and the fun, which I can always appreciate, which is an idea that lends pretty naturally to the itemization of this game. You see, in Dungeons & Dragons, things like magic items aren't quite as available, and when they are available, you have to attune to them, whereas in Baldur's Gate 3, you're going to find all sorts of crazy powerful magical items. You can, of course, equip them in every slot you've got available, which means stacking all sorts of incredibly powerful effects that simply wouldn't be available in the tabletop, and just kind of leaning fully into that fantasy of letting you do these things as opposed to limiting your access to them, I think really works in Baldur's Gate 3's favor, and it is what allows a lot of those balancing decisions and approaches to actually work. So while you'll start out with pretty basic gear, over the course of the game you're going to find all sorts of magic items, artifacts, relics, which are incredibly powerful that you're going to be able to use to gear up your characters based on what they are able to equip. And if you know what you're doing and how to combine all those items, you can have a ton of fun with that stuff. There's even items that Larian has added that have their own sort of unique effects with almost sort of loose item sets that work together in tandem to do something cool. And you can tell they made just a ton of effort in applying all of that interesting itemization to what is normally a little more bare bones in the tabletop version. Now, another part of progression is potions and scrolls, in my opinion. So in addition to all the gear you can equip, you can activate an elixir, usually just one per long rest. They override each other if you try to overlap them. And elixirs can have all sorts of effects that you can apply to your character, such as giving you an extra spell slot for the day, applying the effect of haste at the cost of a lost turn a little bit later, or even just the effect of magic and scrolls as a potion instead. And what's more, while you can find plenty of these potions just on your own, you can also craft them. If you're grabbing up all the materials that you find along the way, you can distill these into extracts that you can then use to make various potions. And using those potions in absence of a character that would normally do the magical effect you're trying to use is going to let you bypass a lot of situations in really unique ways that add a lot to the emergent gameplay here. At the same time, this is also kind of true of scrolls. While you can't craft scrolls, you'll find a ton of them. You can buy them from many vendors, which is also true of the alchemy crafting ingredients. And it is the wildly available nature of both of those things that can let you overcome the deficiencies of a party or character in a way that might not normally be possible, which is, in my opinion, what enables things like Solo Tactician to work. But I would be remiss not to mention probably one of the larger progression systems, which is the Illithid powers. As we progress through the story and check things out, we're going to be tempted by power. Outside of just the normal things, our tadpole is going to try to get us to embrace more tadpoles, to add them to our psychic power, which is going to grant you Illithid powers, which are very strong abilities that can alter the course of the game. These can give you a huge bonus to the first roll against a character, let you guarantee critical hits, kill enemies once they are reduced under a certain threshold, reduce their attributes, group them all together and kill them. And if you go all in on these tadpole, especially on one character, it can get ridiculous. But we're not done yet, because at the end of Act 2, you can actually choose to become a half Illithid, which grants you access to even more of these powers and the ability to innately fly. And if that wasn't enough, right as the game is coming to its conclusion, you can choose to let your character become a full-blown Mind Flayer. And while it doesn't have to be you specifically, and you can avoid this fate as becoming a Mind Flayer isn't exactly seen as a good thing, it is an option that's on the table if you should so choose, though your fate after the fact will certainly be quite a bit different once you make that transformation. That is to say, what happens to your character if you choose to do this is going to be different. All of that finally brings us to the combat section. Now, in many ways, combat in this game is 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons with a lot of smart changes that make it feel and flow a lot better, not just as a turn-based game, but as a CRPG as a whole. I think they did some pretty remarkable things here. That said, this is ultimately a turn-based system, which is going to emphasize things like strategy and approaches in a way that tends to be more reactive than proactive. And what I mean by that is in comparison to a system like Pathfinder 1E, where you have to buff up your characters and cast all these spells before you enter combat to be ideal, 5th edition D&D is all about doing things in combat in the moment. So you don't have to worry about all that pre-buffing and stuff and can kind of just focus on the more direct approach you want to take and then executing on whatever it is your plan was, alongside your other 3 companions, which brings your group size to 4 at a maximum. And while I could focus on the ins and outs of this, such as all the various resources available to you based on what class you're using, reality is I've made videos about that stuff already, including all the basics of combat. So what I'd like to talk about instead here is really about what I think the most remarkable thing this game does in terms of the genre, which is bring the CRPG almost on par with, I would say, immersive sim levels of combat approaches. Because of the way this game is built and how freely it lets you approach things like combat, and the way you can just move around items and set things up ahead of time, combat can be this really emergent, almost dynamic system that in some ways doesn't really have anything to do with the class you're playing, and learning how those things work specifically can lead to a ton of fun that can enable things you might not have normally initially thought about thanks to the itemization and the systems in place in this game. Which brings us back around to that remarkable balancing I mentioned. So for starters, while this is a top-down, typically referred to as isometric, although that is not entirely accurate to say, the game is technically 3D, which means there's a sense of verticality to a lot of the areas you'll find yourself in. And this can lead to things like setting up enemies and then knocking them down off of things, which can then result in fall damage. You can knock them into endless chasms where they will certainly die, via things like knockback arrows, scrolls that will knock enemies back, spells that will knock enemies back. You can pick enemies up if you have the strength score to do so and pass the check and then throw them at other enemies. You can do that with your allies if you want. A lot of things in the environment are destructible and can be used in this manner. You can find explosive barrels, position those near enemies and then blow them up and set off these huge chain reactions. And that's to say nothing of systems like stealth or how invisibility works, and all of those things combine to make a system of combat that you really just don't see anywhere else. And while you can set these things up in real time and then shift into turn-based, you can also turn a turn-based on outside of combat that allows you to set things up a little easier by passing real-time and turns as well. And all of that allows you to set up and do things as you think of them, like you might attempt to do when you're playing a tabletop game of D&D as opposed to playing a video game, because while I love this genre, that is not typically the approach time or budget would allow in a case like this. And it's things like that that really set Baldur's Gate 3 apart from the rest of the genre, which frankly just doesn't have a lot of those elements. And that can lead to, again, just dynamic gameplay and things like that that make this a very attractive game to, I would say, a more mainstream audience, because you think of something and then you can try it, save scum your way back to it, you can save scum in the middle of rolls beforehand, and it's a game that kind of just lets you do whatever you want to do in this playground that they've built for you, which is probably a pretty natural way to lead into the gameplay portion of this video. So I want to talk a little bit about the gameplay in the world and how these things fit together, which is mostly just some general stuff I wanted to cover that didn't quite make sense anywhere else in the video. Now, gameplay-wise, we are controlling our character, of course, and then moving through what is kind of like a big sandbox. And then in certain places, we can move on to the next big sandbox, which the game considers a different region. But there's no sort of world map or anything. You can teleport in between waypoints you'll find, which act as fast travel markers. Now, the downside to that is that I think the nature of that makes it feel less like a big world that I'm exploring versus a more linear adventure where I'm just kind of playing in one sandbox and then moving on to the next when I'm done, which is a little, I would say, juxtaposed between the first half of the game and the second, because while there are 3 acts to this game, I would say acts 1 and 2 comprise the first half of the game and act 3 is the second half. You see, when you move on from act 1 to act 2 and step into the Shadow-Cursed lands, you can actually go back and do things you hadn't already done, but as you move into that new region, things will advance, choices will be cut off, so things will change essentially. However, everything you do in act 1 and 2, in whatever order you do them, is leading towards that one central point, which you need then to overcome, and then enter Act 3, which is the city. And then Act 3, the city, is this big sort of dynamic open sandbox which has like crowd features, which means there are generic NPCs walking around to sort of fill out the streets. Every house almost has something unique and interesting going on. There's all sorts of stuff to get up to, steal from people, interact with, and that part of the game feels more like a living, breathing city. And while if you play the game enough, you can absolutely find the limits of that, I don't think most people are playing this game quite as much as I am, or have rather, so I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to say. But my point in telling you all that is to talk about reactivity versus choice and consequence within the game world. Now, I would definitely say a game like this has a lot of choice and consequence, but it is a bit different than, I would say, the way it's approached elsewhere. As I mentioned when I talked about Divinity Original Sin 2 quite some time ago from now, but that game has an incredible amount of reactivity, and Baldur's Gate 3 is much the same. The game will react to so much that you do and try to do, which is where things like its justice system come in. You can get thrown into jail, you can get attacked by guards, you can turn into a full murder hobo, and there's consequences to that if you try to kill everyone. The game has backup characters and special cases for you. And the game will definitely react to the choices you are making. And oftentimes that will have consequences to them. But by that same token, everything you do in that regard is leading towards one kind of central point, like I mentioned, and that's going to fence you in narratively until you get where you're going. And you compare that to the choice and consequence of other games that set you on a completely unique path that is something you wouldn't see otherwise, and I think you can get what I mean when I say it's a little bit different. Which means much of the gameplay for Baldur's Gate 3 involves entering the new sandbox, finding all the key players, finding how you can interact with various points, what the outcomes are, what you'd like to pursue, what you maybe like to ignore, making your choices and then seeing the outcomes to those choices, such as one ally versus another in the culmination of the final battle. And a lot of that is formed through conversation and dice rolls, where we're going to be putting our skills to the test, as well as all of our bonuses to those rolls, of course, trying to coerce, persuade, or simply beat people to death on our way to our ultimate goal. And that, I would say, is where the gameplay and all the systems and everything really come together to make what Baldur's Gate 3 is all about. They give you this big playground, they tell you to go have fun with it however you want, and you take the characters you've built and all these emergent gameplay systems and you throw them together to try to get the desired outcome. And if you fail, you can either roll with that and see what happens next, as sometimes that can lead to an interesting result in and of itself, or you can simply reload, try again, and approach things how you want. So on the gameplay side of this, it really is, I would say, probably one of the best games at capturing what playing at a tabletop with your friends is all about, where you just kind of do crazy shenanigans and see how things pan out potentially, or it's a more serious role-playing adventure, and ultimately, that choice is up to you because they've given you the systems and the tools in many cases to approach that the way you want to approach it, which is why a game like this is going to be a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Now, in terms of the world, I do think they captured what the setting did really well, which is what Baldur's Gate was supposed to be. I think it's a little unfortunate we didn't get to see the upper city, but even what's available of the city has tons of content. There's all sorts of interconnected branches of this world meeting at that center point that takes into account all the different lore from the setting, all the different races you might run into, such as Dragonborn and what they're getting up to in their day-to-day, on top of the consequences to your actions against the backdrop of this big threat. So all in all, I would say both in its gameplay and its world, the game feels incredibly Dungeons and Dragons, and I think that's most of what you could have asked for from a game like this. And that finally brings us to our Steam Deck section before we will be wrapping this thing up. So I always like to include the Steam Deck portion of my reviews here, and this is no exception. But I'm sure a lot of people know this information by now. Baldur's Gate 3 is verified on the Steam Deck, it's got controller support, it's got cloud saves, and it runs pretty well. I did have some issues running in the actual city with patch 4, but otherwise it was pretty good. You might have to adjust your settings to get an exact stable frame rate, but even the default one is pretty solid. And you combine that with the unique controller support that actually kind of changes the layout and control scheme and how you move and interact, it can actually feel very different from playing it on a mouse and keyboard. So it's pretty obvious they put a ton of effort into making this playable on Steam Deck, and you can definitely do so. And now we're going to talk about some positives and some negatives. Now the positives of Baldur's Gate 3 for me are the production values, it must be said. I mean, the level of cinematic quality here in a CRPG is basically unheard of. I mean, it's bar none. It's kind of at the top of its class in that regard. Like, that's just a level of quality you don't see in games like this. But the other positives are, of course, the smart changes to 5th edition D&D. They made a lot of just really solid changes to make that system more interesting, and while I still prefer other systems overall, if I'm being honest, the changes they've made and how they've freed you up to do things like interact with all sorts of items, which can combine in interesting ways with builds that aren't restricted by multi-class restrictions, etc., all leads to a system that is more fun than I think tabletop 5th edition is. And it's no surprise that a lot of those changes that I enjoy so much then lead to different emergent and dynamic gameplay elements that really add so much to how you approach and tackle combat and choices and consequences that other games in the genre definitely have not done, but we have seen the beginnings of in Divinity Original Sin 2, which had similar approaches to a lot of this stuff, but was still a very different game. But as always, there are a few negatives, and in terms of Baldur's Gate 3, there's a surprising lack of quality of life features. I didn't talk about it too much, but trying to transfer items to characters in camp that aren't in your party is a pain. You have to invite them to and from your party to access their inventory, to change it easily, to swap out equipment with someone, and it's a big pain. Then at character creation, you can't see the changes that they've made to 5th edition D&D to plan your build appropriately without going to a wiki or just kind of seeing what happens when you get to that level. And for a game that does as much right as this does, to then drop the ball on very simple things that would have made this game more enjoyable that other games in the genre have done is a bit disappointing, though obviously not a deal breaker. There's also the fact that the game lacks a certain amount of challenge. I really do think this game could use one more difficulty. If anything, just an option to customize the difficulty, maybe adjust some specific modifiers even to get to a challenge you feel comfortable with would be a very welcome change. And while, yes, a game like this is very much so focused on the role-playing, the party, the characters, etc., there are people like myself who play these games to enjoy the systems that they are based on, that is to say the tabletop rule sets, and getting to enjoy the story and the party and getting to know them while also engaging with all those fun tactical elements is a big part of that, for me at least, and the game could stand to at least have the option to make it more difficult or customize that experience in some way. But again, a relatively minor problem. And then for my final negative, it is an interesting thing, because on one hand, I think Larian has done better with it in terms of this game than they ever have previously, but it's still a bit of an issue, and that is the quality once you get towards the later endpoints of the game, which was a concern of mine leading up to the release, and to their credit, they got it patched up and working much better very quickly, which is not something that could be said of Divinity Original Sin 2, which had to wait for the Enhanced Edition to roll around. And I'm sure some of it is absolutely down to everything going on in the city itself, but once you get to that point in the game, and especially when the game ends and you see the epilogues roll and it's just kind of not really a big satisfying closure to the game itself, and then you don't see the upper city outside of it just being destroyed, for instance, and it can have a problem with closing out this already grand adventure. And while it is honestly certainly hard to complain about enjoying a game so much that it kind of eventually had to end and they had to at some point make that ending happen, and I would just say that it's a game that struggles to bring a satisfying end to all the decisions and fun you had along the way, and that can lead to a bit of an underwhelming finish in an otherwise great game, which brings me to my conclusion. Over the course of this very long review, probably one of the longest if not the longest I've done, I hope I've made it clear that there's so much about this game that I enjoy and that I love, and that's why I played it for 11 playthroughs in like 500 hours. But as much as people have loved this game, I also don't think it's perfect. I think they dropped the ball on some places that other CRPGs have gotten right for a long time. I think some options just to make the game harder would be welcome, and I've got some nitpicks about the lore and the story here and there. So while I think this is an incredible game, I do think there's also things that other games in the genre do better than this one does. But a lot of that is simply a matter of preference, I admit. And those nitpicks aside, Baldur's Gate 3 is truly a remarkable game, which means recommending it is a foregone conclusion if you hadn't figured that out by now. It's a wonderful game. I think everyone who's even remotely interested in it should definitely try it out. But perhaps what's more interesting to me about this game is something we'll just have to wait to see how it pans out, and that is to say the game's legacy, what this is going to be remembered as, what it's going to inspire in the future, because in so many ways Baldur's Gate 3 is such a unique title in both the genre and just on its own. I think Larian themselves is going to have such a tough time following this game up, because I just don't think it's something that could easily be replicated by any stretch of the imagination. What's more is that, as I've alluded to throughout this review, other games in this genre are their own unique experiences that are very different from this. So while I can hardly speak to what happens from here, where the genre goes or anything like that, or grandiose claims about how this has changed the standards of the industry, what I can say is that I hope this game and its approaches to things and the success that it found in doing what it set out to do in a very specific way inspires people to try to make their own unique things in that exact manner. And I hope this game inspires a lot of people to check out the rest of the genre that I personally love so much. And while you'll hardly find anything that matches the, sheer production value of this, to be honest, which is why a lot of them have struggled to find that mainstream audience, but I hope this encourages people to try them out, because it is just a fantastic genre that Baldur's Gate 3 is an incredibly welcome and amazing addition to. And to sort of end this video, before I wrap it up, there is kind of one last thing I wanted to mention, and that is that the Baldur's Gate series as a whole is a series that has had a profound impact on my life, both, simply playing the games, the originals when I was pretty young. I was only like 10 when I picked up the first one, and in terms of covering them. I've played and reviewed the older games, I've made videos about them, how to get into them. Chances are, if you're watching this video, there's not an insubstantial shot that you might have watched those videos previously, as they did exceptionally well around the release of Baldur's Gate 3. And being able to make those guides and share the genre that I love, while also being able to make a living off of it, which I've been doing for a while, I've been reviewing games for a few years, which has been my full-time job, has just been a wild experience, as the Baldur's Gate series has always been such a catalyst to building up a community around the things that I enjoy and get an opportunity to talk about so much, which was really exemplified by this game. And in fact, all of my videos and guides and everything did so well on the lead up to and after this game launched that the ad revenue I earned off of those videos has put me in a position to pay off my house. Covering Baldur's Gate 3, and honestly continuing to cover if they put out any big updates or expansions or DLC, wherever they happen to go from here, who knows. But regardless of what's to come, I can genuinely say that Baldur's Gate 3 was a life-changing game for me, which is bizarre to say the very least. So if you've enjoyed any of the content I've made on this game, if my guides have helped you out on this or the previous ones, and if any of those videos got you to hang around the channel and check out a myriad of other different games that are all their own unique and interesting experience with upsides and downsides, all their own, I wanted to take a moment to just say thank you to the community, as it has been a pretty overwhelming experience for me. And while I don't know what's going to happen in terms of Larian Studios and where the industry goes, what I can say is that for me, I hope you stick around. I'll be doing more reviews. I love video games. I love this genre. And I hope people stick around so I can talk about more of them with you. That, though, is going to do it for this very long video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.